So, Jason, in our extemporaneously evolving series on CPS errors, we have been discussing the question of, in the event of a CPS misalignment, where misissuance is entirely the product of the CPS misalignment and not inherent in failure to comply with BR root program requirements. In that scenario, at present, the prescribed remedy and the only prescribed remedy is revocation of the misaligned certs.
Right. And you said something in the previous episode that I think was worth repeating, which is revocation is a tool, but it's not in the end.
It's not the end goal.
It's not the end goal itself.
Right.
So therefore, are there other remedies?
Yeah.
Because, and I think it's worth restating, a certificate that's been misissued because it doesn't follow BRs, that's something that absolutely needs to be revoked. And we've been following those rules for years and years. We're not talking about certificates that are, that have broken a rule. We're talking about certificates that are, the rule that they've broken is from a statement.
Yeah, I mean, if we could use some observed examples. Let's talk about DCV. Let's suppose that a CA has a DCV method, which is any stranger can come up and say, hey, I own this domain. Okay, that would be a bad, vulnerable, and ultimately non-compliant DCV method. And if it came to light that you had issued a cert that way, right? This particular cert, what happened is someone knocked on the window. I said, can I help you? And he said, hey, I really own this domain. And I said, okay, thanks. Then that would be deemed to be a misissued cert. That would be a cert that would be misissued regardless of what your CPS said. Even if your CPS said that was allowed, it would still be a misissued cert, right? So that cert would have to be revoked under any circumstances. And then you could, at that point, you could perform DCV using a proffer method. If it turned out that they really did own that cert, you can go ahead and you could issue a new cert that had used DCV as a proper method, right? Because the problem was with the issuance practices.
Yeah.
Now, let's suppose, on the other hand, that I have a perfectly acceptable DCV method that I could use, and it would be deemed to be secure and reliable and BR compliant and root store program requirement or compliant. And let's suppose, though, that my CPS did not say that DCV method was allowed. Now what happens is you have this problem, which is that I may have used method number 7, but an outsider looking at my certificates would fairly make the assumption that I absolutely have never used method number 7. And that's where it's wrong. This cert was issued using method number 7, but I've said that I don't use method number 7, right? That's the problem. So the way we remedy that today is we revoke that cert. We update the CPS. We issue a new cert on or after the date of the updated CPS. So that if someone goes and reads that CPS, it says, method number 7 is a possibility, and indeed method number 7 was used. It's aligned. What does that do? It gives us transparency. It gives us an outsider an opportunity to understand specifically what the behavior was. Okay? So if we could give that understanding to that outsider in a reliable way that was accessible to anybody with the skills to read a CPS, that would accomplish the same goal. And if the goal were accomplished without the revocation of that certificate, the goal would still be accomplished. You see my point?
Yes. In other words, the making the statement kind of explicit, along with revocation, that kind of a method would account for what the real reasoning of why you have a CPS anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to understand why you do things and what you're going to get. So, I'm all about the analogies. Stick with me a little bit for a little bit of an analogy. I was living in a place one time where they brought in photograph-based speed traps, essentially. They put things by the sides of the freeway, and if you were going over a certain speed, you'd get rather than being pulled over by a police officer. And it was deemed to be unsuccessful because they hadn't generated enough revenue. And I turn around and I say, okay, well, that's a misalignment of the goal and the activity, because the goal is to prevent people from speeding. If they didn't generate a lot of revenue, that means that people weren't speeding. That's good. The goal was met. And you could see that there was this misalignment. So it'd be a similar thing here, right? If we start getting upset that we're not revoking enough certificates,
right,
then we're missing the goal, right? The goal is that transparency and that alignment of practice with stated potential practices in a way that anyone can understand. That transparency and that alignment is the goal. The revocation is an unfortunate but sometimes necessary tool to get that goal. The revocation is not a goal.
Yep.
Right? And so I start to say, well, gosh, this appears to be a version controlling and errata recording exercise. These are solved problems.
Yes, sir.
People have been doing this for a long time.
You and I, before this podcast, had talked a little bit about this is a solved problem in computer science.
Yeah.
I think that the profound, ubiquitous usage of things like Git and GitHub.
So just maybe it's as simple as put it on GitHub.
Maybe it is.
It might be that simple. Maybe not. Maybe there's more nuance to it than that, and that's fine. And that's something that the community can work through. But I go, gosh, at the end of the day, if the reason we're doing all of this is so that any sufficiently knowledgeable, independent outside researcher, be that a white hat or a college professor or an auditor or a public CA or a large enterprise or whoever, wants to be able to go and look at the CPS and understand what this public CA is doing, and if we think that's a worthwhile and valid goal, which I do, then methods that get us to that goal with equal reliability should all be on the table.
The purpose for all of it is to ensure transparency, and that certificates are issued. Every certificate in the world is transparent in how it was made.
Yeah, right.
And if you can achieve that, if that's the goal, if you can achieve that, then you've done your day job.
Yeah, and on earlier episodes of this thing, I've told the story about the ham, so I'm not going to tell that story again.
Yeah.
The basic idea is someone's cutting off the ends of the ham, and it turns out the only reason they're doing it is for something that doesn't exist anymore.
That's right.
I think this is that. Like, I think if you live in a world of blunt instruments and the only way that you can remedy a problem is to smack it in the head with a sledgehammer because that's all you got, then that sucks, but it's what we have to do. But when you get to the point where you have better methods and you keep hitting things in the head with sledgehammers just because it's what you're used to, then that is, it's suboptimal. It's intellectually lazy, and we're not advancing the state of the practices and the technology. And to some degree, that's our job to advance those things.
Absolutely. Tim, what's interesting to me is that analogy of the speed trap is an interesting one in a couple different ways, because sometimes we find out that the real goal of the speed trap
isn't what we were told. Right. Correct. I think that was the case in that case. Yes.
I think in this case, I don't think the goal anywhere is like, why should the goal ever be revocation?
And I very firmly believe, I mean, it's good that you brought that up. Yes, in that case, it certainly appears there was a hidden agenda. in this case, there is not a hidden agenda. The agenda is the thing I said. The agenda is transparency and a true match of real-world practices to stated practices. That is the objective, period. And let's find the best ways to accomplish those objectives and go do them, even if they're not the thing we did yesterday.
And precisely because it's not what we did yesterday. Yeah. It's funny, so far in this particular, Toronto season that we're doing, I think that one of the themes that's coming out is a better internet. It's almost all of our podcasts so far today that we've been recording have been about moving towards a better internet and away from the Wild West that we had. And part of that is even antiquated thinking about the ways in which we started to build controls. And we need to look at how did people solve this in other parts of computer science. And you and I said last night before we, as we were preparing for these podcasts, these problems have been solved, and we need to look very hard at taking best practices from other parts of computer science and using them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I very much believe in my heart that this is completely doable. And I don't know why we would force revocation as the only possible remedy. I think revocation is a fine remedy and should be available as a remedy. And if it turns out that I had one misissued cert because I trusted this guy that knocked on the window, maybe the best path forward is just to kill that cert and do it right. And that's fine. Nothing wrong with it. But to require that it be the only remedy we can use under all circumstances, ultimately, I just think it's lazy.
Yeah. I think you're right, Tim. Well said. Great episode. Thank you.
Thank you.